Good day. Today is Wednesday, 18th December 2024. We have reports of more Russian advances in the area of the special military operation, reports of the Ukrainians planning some kind of offensive of their own, possibly against Bryansk region. We have also reports of fierce arguments and quarrels amongst European countries about the idea of sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. This in advance of any agreement to secure peace in Ukraine or even negotiations to that effect, just saying. We also have more news from the Syrians, from Syria, and a most remarkable, astonishing meeting in Ankara between the Turkish President Erdogan, and the President of the European Council, Ursula von der Leyen. But I'm going to begin with the story that I started my program with yesterday, which is the assassination in Moscow of Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, who was the head of Russia's nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare troops. Now, within just a few hours of the killing, the Russian authorities apparently arrested two men who they are alleging were the perpetrators of the attack. And the lead, one of the two, Ahmad Kurbanov, who we are told is a native of Uzbekistan, has actually given a confession of which the FSB, the Russian security service that also deals with counter-terrorism matters. Anyway, this confession, the FSB filmed, and it has been published in the Russian media. And I haven't seen the film, and I don't propose to. I'm always deeply uncomfortable about watching films of that kind. But the Russian media are quoting him as saying that I came to Moscow on instructions from the Ukrainian Special Services. He purchased a scooter in preparation for the terrorist attack. Then a few months later, he received components for an explosive device. He subsequently installed the device on the scooter and parked it near the house where Kirillov lived. He rented and parked a car sharing vehicle nearby, which contained a camera recording of what was happening at the entrance of the building. When Kirillov left his apartment, exited from the entrance of the apartment building, Kurbanov says that he remotely activated the explosive device. And the FSB has apparently issued a further statement saying that Ukrainian Special Forces officers were involved in organizing the terrorist attack and that they will be found and punished as they deserve. So that's what the Russian authorities are saying. Now, to stress, they're claiming, or the reports, the original reports, first published by the Russian newspaper Izvestia, said that two people had been captured by the Russian authorities. But so far, we've only heard from Ahmad Kurbanov, and he's the only one of the two who has been identified. Now, all of this is very interesting. There has not so far been any legal or judicial process. I appreciate that many people will be deeply cynical about any legal and judicial process taking place in Russia, especially after this sort of incident. I ought to say that my own contacts with Russian lawyers and my own very minor dealings with the Russian legal system which took place, it must be acknowledged, some years ago, were overall positive, but obviously people are entitled to their cynicism, and I'm not going to push back on it. Having said that, in my experience, even a distorted legal process can provide a great deal more information about events, and it might be a good idea to wait whilst that process, until that process gets underway, before arriving at any final conclusions. But we do now have two suspects, one of whom has given a recorded confession. There's a film of him, by the way, giving that confession. And that person has provided us with a certain amount of information, and the information he's given is consistent with what we know about the attack on Kirillov. Now, there are some really extraordinary facts about the attack on Kirillov. Firstly, Kirillov was attacked at the entrance as he was exiting with his aide. The building, dom, the Russians call apartment buildings dom, a dom, which means a house, but these are often very big apartment buildings indeed, as he was exiting the apartment building in which he had his apartment. And apparently, Kirillov had spoken to a number of people for some time, friends and acquaintances, and he apparently told them that his revelations about the presence of various laboratories on Ukrainian territory had made him a marked man, and that he was fully aware of the fact that he was being hunted, but that this was not going to deter him from continuing to disclose the important information that had come into his possession. And in fact, he continued to do so. Now, I have to say that does beg the question if Kirillov was aware of the fact that people were coming after him, about why the Russian authorities didn't provide him with additional protection. Did he refuse it? Was the offer never made? Did he demand protection? As I said, there's lots of unanswered questions here. That's one obvious point which I would make. The second, and this is about the revelations that Kirillov made about the presence of the laboratories in Ukraine. I ought to say that in Russia, the popular view, the one that the vast majority of people appear to hold, is that Kirillov was targeted precisely because he gave away this sort of information. And some Russian officials, including the spokesman for the foreign ministry, seem to be insinuating that Kirillov was killed, obviously on the instructions of Ukraine, but as a result of his work, Western agencies were also involved in some way. That's what they're alleging. I'm not saying, and I want to make this clear, that that is true, but that story is circulating in Russia. The United States, the State Department, has categorically denied that the United States had any role in Kirillov's assassination at all. Just to say that. Now, yesterday I discussed the difficulties that I'd experienced on the one occasion when I discussed the topic of the labs in Ukraine, the ones that Kirillov was talking about. And a number of people pointed out on the threads, and obviously I've seen comments about this in many places, that no less a person than Victoria Nuland went to Congress, gave evidence, and appeared to confirm the existence of those labs. I remember that extremely well, and I've never seen any retraction or reversal of what Victoria Nuland said, and one would assume that she would know. All I would say is that I remember experiencing the problems I did after Victoria Nuland gave her evidence. But anyway, there we are. That's you can put it all together. You can draw conclusions as you wish. I have to continue to be, on this topic, extremely careful about what I say. Frustrating though I find it, and of course I have to perhaps apologize for doing so. Anyway, there we go. So, an assassination. The Russians have the suspects. One of those suspects has given a very interesting confession. There are some questions that can be asked about why Kirillov was not provided with more protection, and the Russian public opinion seems fairly clear about the reason for the assassination, and some people in Russia are pointing their fingers not just at Ukraine but at the Western powers, and the United States, for its part, has categorically denied that it had any role. Now, there is one further point that I do want to make, and this is about Kurbanov. Now, the Russians have also provided some further information about what induced him to act as the assassin, and it does seem as if he was essentially a contract killer. Again, this is all based apparently on what Kurbanov himself has said. It has not yet been tested through any legal process. But this is a report that I've read in Redovka. Obviously it's in Russian, so I'm using a machine translation, but I might improve it a little as I read what is being said here. The suspect in the murder of Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov and his assistant Ilya Polikarpov was promised a cash reward of $100,000 and travel to European countries for the crime committed. This was reported by the press service of the Investigative Committee. The Investigative Committee is a completely different law enforcement agency from the FSB. It is the FSB that published the footage of Kurbanov's confession, but it will be the Investigative Committee, which is essentially a police agency. It fulfills some of the higher police functions that the FBI does in the United States. Anyway, it has now been tasked with conducting the full investigation and bringing Kurbanov and his accomplice to trial. And the Investigative Committee also says that Kurbanov was recruited by Ukrainian Special Services. He's currently being questioned by an investigator as part of a criminal case opened under 3 articles. He faces up to life imprisonment for the crime. The Investigative Committee's report states that he is a citizen of Uzbekistan, born in 1995. So he was offered a substantial amount of money, $100,000, and an escape to somewhere in Europe, and that the people who recruited him were the Ukrainian secret services. This is what the FSB and Russia's Investigative Committee are telling us, and they're telling us these things on the back of Kurbanov's confession, or alleged confession. Now, I have to say, reading all of this, there are certain things about this affair that do remind me of what happened back in March following the Crocus City Hall attack. Now, that attack was carried out by Islamist terrorists who were associated with ISIS Khorasan, which is a branch of ISIS that operates in Central Asia. But the Russian authorities have made it fairly clear, in fact they've outright said, that they believe that these people who carried out the attack were working for Ukrainian intelligence, that Ukrainian intelligence had made available, had provided them with an exit route out of Russia, and that the individuals who carried out the attack, who belonged to ISIS Khorasan, were captured by the Russian authorities as they were trying to escape towards the Ukrainian border in, from memory, Bryansk region. Just saying. So, there is some similarities here, and I don't want to push these too far because we don't yet know very much about Kurbanov, and there is no word so far that he belongs to any Islamist or jihadi group, such as, for example, ISIS Khorasan. But nonetheless, like the perpetrators of the attack on Crocus Hall, or the alleged perpetrators, they've not yet been convicted, well, they were all Tajiks from Central Asia, but Kurbanov is an Uzbek from Uzbekistan. Very different countries that are not friendly, just to quickly add, but nonetheless, from a Russian perspective, they're both Central Asian countries, Muslim countries, and apparently ISIS Khorasan has a presence in both. And in both cases, there are claims that even though these perpetrators of these attacks were Central Asians, who were in both cases also, by the way, offered cash rewards, though the one offered to Kurbanov is substantially greater than the ones that were allegedly offered to the Crocus City Hall attackers. But anyway, notwithstanding that, the Russians believe that it was Ukrainian special services who were the organizers and the inspirers, who were in fact the clients for which these people acted as the contractors. Now, I'm not saying that these two cases are identical in any way. I know there's been a lot of pushback, especially in the Western media, denying categorically that there was any Ukrainian involvement in the events at Crocus City Hall. And, the Ukrainians are also denying it as well. And there's been no legal process, no trial. There's been no final decision as to what the cases are about. No formal adjudication so far. But there is one rather interesting, important fact about this latest attack, which is that though yesterday, towards the late afternoon, several hours after the assassination of Kirillov took place, Mikhailo Podolyak, Zelensky's aide, actually went to the Ukrainian media, appeared to distance Ukraine from the assassination of Kirillov, floated theories that Kirillov might have been assassinated as a result of some kind of internecine struggle within the Russian military and security agencies. A preposterous idea, by the way. Anyway, that is what Podolyak was doing. But of course, by that point, he was in effect closing the stable door after the horse had bolted, because various Ukrainian officials had, albeit anonymously, already confirmed, in fact bragged about, Ukraine's involvement to the Western media. And in fact, I've been reading articles, for example, in the Daily Telegraph, which have been, frankly, exulting in the assassination of Kirillov and have been hailing it as a masterstroke by the Ukrainian secret services, who supposedly have humiliated Putin by carrying out an assassination of a prominent military official in Moscow itself. So Podolyak, now trying to distance Ukraine from what happened, has come altogether too late. I wonder whether the reason that Podolyak came out and gave the denial, which contradicted the private bragging that had taken place a few hours before, is because the Ukrainians learned that the contractor, the person who they had contracted to assassinate Kirillov, had been captured, with a strong likelihood that he would make the confession that he has done. So that it was felt necessary, now that an actual formal link to Ukraine potentially has been found, for the Ukrainians to deny it before any problems, any concerns start to develop, especially in the West, especially on the part of the Trump administration. And I'm going to say this, and here I say straight away that I am obviously moving well ahead of events and well ahead of the information that has been provided. But if it does turn out that Kurbanov was involved, and I've no reason to think he wasn't, by the way, his confession so far sounds very plausible. But if Kurbanov was involved, and if, for example, he was involved with some jihadi groups based in Central Asia, such as ISIS Khorasan, then it does cast the events at Crocus City Hall in a rather different light from that we have heard about in the West, and it may suggest that there might be more substance to the Russian claims of Ukrainian involvement in that attack than many have assumed up to now. Again, as you will no doubt have realized, I am choosing my words extremely carefully. Having said that, let me stress again that this is moving a little bit ahead of events. Well, anyway, ahead of events. We will see what further information comes from the investigation and from the judicial process, which presumably will follow. Now, the Russians have been making more comments about Ukraine and about Ukraine's involvement in what they refer to as terrorism. And the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman has actually given a briefing, and she did this, of course, directly after Kirillov was assassinated, but in connection with the report published by the US State Department on counterterrorism for 2023, which was published on the 12th of December. And the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman pointed out that the report intentionally avoids, I'm here quoting her directly, intentionally avoids addressing or even acknowledging the issues, to say the least, of the Zelensky regime being turned into a terrorist cell. As in previous years, this report, full of falsehoods, is based on a complete absence of any standards except one: political bias and manipulation of facts. The only thing it confirms is that the Kiev regime is deliberately supported and justified by the United States, although American money and weapons poured in uncontrollably have turned it into a breeding ground for terrorism and a testing ground for increasingly barbaric and sophisticated methods of undermining Russia's security. The report features clumsy attempts to deny Moscow's accusations against Kiev. How outrageous all this sounds now, especially after the world saw the footage of a terrorist attack for which the Ukrainian side again claimed responsibility, committed on December 17th, resulting in the death of Igor Kirillov. The State Department did not hesitate to include blatant falsehoods in its report. It claims that not a single act of terrorism occurred in Russia in 2023. This is fantastic. Naturally, the State Department turns a blind eye to any terrorist attacks against journalists, public figures, or civilian infrastructure. So, I do wonder about all of these statements, whether in fact the Russian Foreign Ministry, which is presumably being briefed by the FSB and by the investigative committee into their investigations into the Crocus City Hall attack and obviously the latest Kirillov attack, whether they aren't providing the Foreign Ministry with a great deal of information which they claim leads back to Kiev and which the Russians are putting together and which they might eventually release in a report. Well, of course, if the Russians do that, I predict that the report will be ignored and dismissed in the West, or at least in Europe. Perhaps Donald Trump, with his known feelings about terrorism, might take the report a little more seriously, though I doubt it, to be honest. But, of course, the Russians can also then circulate the report amongst their friends, China, India, Saudi Arabia, wherever, and, well, we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, an interesting set of developments in the Kirillov affair. This affair certainly bears watching. And of course, the Crocus City Hall investigation continues to be underway. And presumably at some point, we're going to get charges and a trial taking place in respect of both. I ought to say that judicial practice in Russia is that even in the event of confessions, the entire evidence has to be presented in court. So we will get, when the trial does take place, a great deal of information which of course we are entirely at liberty to treat with skepticism and to criticize and even dismiss as untrue, but which will nonetheless, when it's provided, give us a much greater and deeper insight into what actually happened. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say today about the Kirillov affair. Now, let's turn now to the events on the front lines, because, to repeat again, in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine, it is the front lines that are the most, it's the events on the ground that are ultimately dictating the outcome of the war. The only reason why there is talk now about negotiations is because the Russians are winning the war. Even if Donald Trump had won the elections, but the Russians were not winning the war or were losing the war, if that had been the scenario, it's most unlikely that Donald Trump or anyone in the Trump team would have been interested in moving forward with a negotiating process of the sort that is being discussed. It's because the Russians are winning the war, because they're getting more and more ground all the time, that we can see talk about a negotiation process starting to gain traction and to get underway. Now, as I have been doing recently, I'm going to give only a quick summary of events on the various battlefronts. The first is that there is a lot of chatter, internet chatter, about the Ukrainians trying to cobble together some kind of intervention force so in order to launch a new counterattack in some direction. And the chatter suggests at the present time that the target of this new Ukrainian offensive is going to be Russia's Bryansk region. There's said to be a concentration of Ukrainian troops in Chernihiv region, and it's being alleged that they're being prepared for another strike into Bryansk region. Now, this is fully possible. I would make two quick observations. Firstly, a couple of weeks ago, there were also rumors of a coming Ukrainian offensive. These were spurred by certain comments of General Syrskis, in which he said that Ukraine couldn't afford to remain always passive and on the defensive. It would need to go on the offensive somewhere, and many people thought that that meant that there would be an offensive, though several weeks have now passed since Syrskis said those things, and so far no significant offensive has taken place. Anyway, I remember that at that time the focus of speculation was that the Ukrainians were going to advance across the Kharkiv reservoir and would make yet another of their many attempts to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Well, that was the speculation about 2-3 weeks ago, but it never really materialized. At least it hasn't materialized for the moment. Now the focus is on Bryansk region. And before I move on to discuss all of that, may I just make a quick point that, to the best of my recollection, the Crocus City Hall attackers were trying to escape Russia through Bryansk region. And if you want to put 2 and 2 together and come to a specific number, you might notice that Kurbanov had been offered the option of making his home in some European country. How was he going to leave Russia? Perhaps he too was supposed to leave Russia via Bryansk region, which perhaps coincidentally, is rumoured to be the possible location of a future Ukrainian counterattack. Again, I'm being a bit mischievous here because, frankly, I don't think the facts really lead to any conclusion, any positive conclusion here. But anyway, let's look at these rumours of a Ukrainian counterattack in Bryansk region. Well, they may be true. These stories may be correct. But I would say this. The reports all say that this grouping, this offensive grouping that the Ukrainians are supposed to be assembling, is being created out of the Ukrainian forces that have been defending northern Kharkiv region, Volchansk, Lipsy, and Kharkiv city itself. Now, there has been very little discussion about what's going on in Volchansk recently, but I would say quickly this. Latest maps do seem to confirm that the group of forces north has indeed taken complete control of the area of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk and also of the aggregate plant there. There are reports from group of forces north themselves that they're gradually clearing eastern Volchansk north of the Volcha River. And in fact, there's been pictures now and film which show Russian assault troops advancing through the ruins of what's left of Volchansk, eastern Volchansk, north of the Volcha River. So it looks like that battle might indeed be coming to an end. So it could be that the Ukrainians have come to realize that the Battle of Volchansk, which has been very difficult and very protracted for the Russians, almost certainly because they've had to focus instead on dealing with Kursk region and have not given Volchansk the energy and priority that back in May it looked as if they would. Anyway, perhaps the Ukrainians have realized that Volchansk is a lost cause, and maybe they are starting to pull troops out of the area of Volchansk and are trying to form a grouping with them. But there is a report today in TASS which was confirming that Ukrainian troops are being pulled out of Kharkiv region, out of Volchansk and those sort of places, is suggesting that they're being sent to some completely different location, not Chernihiv region at all, with a view to conducting an attack on Bryansk, but instead to Pokrovsk. And the report speaks of the Ukrainians carrying out a redeployment towards Pokrovsk, and it appears in TASS. The Ukrainian armed forces have redeployed servicemen from Kharkiv to Pokrovsk. The security forces have told TASS. The Ukrainian troops from the Kharkiv area have been transferred near Pokrovsk. They are trying to hold the defense in this direction, the sources said. According to the security forces, the Ukrainian military is also transferring equipment and weapons to this section of the line of engagement. So, if this report is true, the one in TASS, then there has indeed been a movement of Ukrainian troops out of Kharkiv region. But they're not going to Chernihiv with a view to launching an offensive in Bryansk region. They're being redeployed instead to the south to try to stem what is now the rapidly accelerating collapse in Pokrovsk. And it is that which I am now going to turn to, because accelerating collapse is exactly what we are now starting to see. Now, a couple of days ago, there were all sorts of reports that General Tarnavsky, the new military commander, Ukrainian military commander in the area of Pokrovsk, had ordered a successful counterattack which had supposedly knocked the Russians out of northern Shevchenko, an important village to the southwest of Pokrovsk, which the Russians captured some days ago, about a week ago, and whose fall has put the position of the Ukrainian troops defending Pokrovsk in a very difficult position, because the Russians advancing west from Shevchenko are in a position to cut off the railway lines and the roads leading into Pokrovsk and sending supplies to the Ukrainian grouping there from the west. So there was a counterattack, except that we now have reports confirmed by the Ukrainians themselves that the counterattack towards Shevchenko was a complete disaster. It failed utterly. I've even seen one claim that an entire Ukrainian brigade was destroyed by the Russians over the course of this counterattack. Now, I have to say, I think that is unquestionably an overstatement. I cannot imagine that a whole brigade of the Ukrainian army could have been destroyed in one counterattack in that kind of way. Perhaps we're talking about a battalion or even a company. No doubt the Ukrainians did suffer severe losses, but I can't believe it was as much as a whole brigade. But the point is, the counterattack failed. The Russians are in strong control of Shevchenko and of Novotroitsky, another village in this same area that they have also captured. And there are reports now that they are surrounding the next village to the west, Pyshanye, and that they have taken it into pincers, and that Pyshanye also is about to fall. So, given that the Russians are gradually, well, not actually gradually, but quite rapidly, in fact, gaining control of all the villages immediately to the south of Pokrovsk and are shelling the city on a regular basis and also bombing it, and that Russian drones are active over Pokrovsk, and that the Ukrainian defenses there apparently are shaky, and given report after report from commentator after commentator talking about the importance of Pokrovsk to the overall Ukrainian defense, the best discussion, in my opinion, was done by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. It would make complete sense, given that the Ukrainians have just been defeated, and defeated badly, by the Russians south of Pokrovsk, if the Ukrainians were indeed hurriedly transferring troops from Kharkiv region to the Pokrovsk area, which incidentally presumably means that the Russian advance in Volchansk and in Lipsy and close to Kharkiv city itself might now start to accelerate. It also perhaps means that pressure on the Ukrainians in Kursk region will increase, because perhaps they have fewer reserves in this area now. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, but there are lots of reports that the Russians have now made significant advances in the north of the Kursk pocket. They're supposed to have entered or recaptured this village of Ruskaya Polnachnya, village which has been fought over many, many times, but it looks as if the Ukrainians are now being decisively pushed back from this village, and the Russians appear to have captured all sorts of other positions in the north of the pocket, and the Ukrainians are being pushed back. The Ukrainians, by the way, are busy claiming that the Russians are achieving these advances in Kursk region, which they admit are rapid as a result of the commitment of the North Korean troops. The State Department is, of course, backing the Ukrainian claims, and the State Department is also claiming that the North Koreans have suffered heavy losses in the fighting in Kursk, though apart from one photo of an Asian-looking soldier who could be Russian, but who some say looks like a North Korean, I haven't seen any evidence. I still haven't seen any actual, real evidence that there are any North Korean soldiers really there. Anyway, that's the situation in Kursk. It's the situation in Pokrovsk. It's the situation in Volchansk. The Russians are said to be enlarging their bridgehead north of Kupiansk, the bridgehead they've achieved north of Kupiansk itself and west of the Oskol River. The Russian news agency TASS is now reporting that the Russians have occupied another swathe of territory in northern Chasiv Yar, close to the industrial buildings, where the Ukrainians have tried to launch another counterattack to try to stop the Russian advance in the industrial zone where the refractory plant is located. It's clear that there are lots of encounter battles going on for control of this industrial area. But again, the trend is clear. The Russians are pushing forward. In Toretsk, we are definitely, it seems to me, looking at the end of the battle. The Russians have captured the last remaining area of high-rise buildings. They've now reached the last remaining mine, the Toretsk mine, with its slag heap in northwestern Toretsk. Apparently it's a small mine and a relatively small slag heap. It's said that it's unlikely that the Ukrainians will be able to defend for long there. It's universally acknowledged that when this last location in Toretsk is captured by the Russians, Ukrainian defenses in Toretsk will finally collapse, and it's likely that the Ukrainians are going to have to withdraw. And in Kharkiv, the Russians are continuing to advance, clearing territory south of Kharkiv itself, advancing towards the west. Today, by the way, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that Stary Terny, the village on the western end of the Kharkiv reservoir, is under Russian control, though everybody has been aware of this for at least a week. But anyway, one way or the other, it looks to me mostly like mopping up operations being conducted by the Russians. South of Kharkiv, the Ukrainian troops in Kharkiv have withdrawn to the power station located to the west of Kharkiv itself. As I said in my program yesterday, they are at serious risk of being surrounded if they remain there. So this is perhaps not a wise plan. When all of this territory is cleared, when Kharkiv has fallen, when the thermal plant, the power plant has been cleared as well, when all the villages have been cleared, the Russians will be able to release forces to join the attack on Pokrovsk. And again, to repeat, there are rumors that from time to time Russian special forces and reconnaissance troops enter Pokrovsk itself. The last battle, the last fight in this great battle in southern Donbass, in Pokrovsk itself, appears now to be in effect underway. And last but not least, the Ukrainians now acknowledge that the village of Novy Komar, north of Velikaya Novosilka, is under firm Russian control. Ukrainian counterattacks to push the Russians out of this village were unsuccessful. The Russians appear to have finally captured the village of Makharovka to the south of Velikaya Novosilka, and they're advancing west of Velikaya Novosilka to the main road which connects Velikaya Novosilka to Guelyapolye, a little to the west. It looks as if Velikaya Novosilka is now effectively encircled. Apparently, Syrskyi and Zelensky are rejecting all requests from the Ukrainian soldiers there for a pullback. It looks as if another cauldron is being prepared. It looks like Ugledar all over again. So that's the situation on the battlefronts. I do not know of a single place, a single location where things are going well for Ukraine. The Ukrainians still are able to put up a fight, but they're finding it increasingly difficult to do so. With every day and week that the battle goes on, their strength ebbs, even as the strength of the Russians appears to grow stronger. So that is the situation on the battle lines. Now that then brings me back to this vexed question of negotiations. And it seems to me that there are various lines of thought there. There is a view that Putin and his officials are very keen on some kind of negotiated settlement of the situation in Ukraine, and that they're prepared to make substantial concessions in order to achieve it, that they're prepared to accept a great deal less than their stated objectives, that they won't insist, for example, on the entire territory of the four regions being brought under Russian control. They are prepared for the question of Ukraine's entry into NATO to be put back indefinitely rather than given up entirely, and that they are prepared to accept the possibility of a peacekeeping force by the Western powers deployed in Ukraine. And those who think that this is a deal that will eventually be done divide, in my opinion, into two camps. Those who want this deal because basically they want to see the war and the killing end as soon as possible. That is one group. And the other group, another group, of which serious and thoughtful analysts like Jim Jatras and John Helmer, to name just two, they think this is going to happen, not because they think that this is a good idea. On the contrary, from their perspective, this would be a terrible sellout, a betrayal of what the Russian soldiers have been fighting for in Ukraine, but because they remain convinced that Putin, who is a balancer, who has to constantly keep various perspectives in Moscow in sight, who still encounters pressure from liberal, pro-Western oligarchs in Moscow who still want a resolution of Russia's conflict with the West, that Putin will go for this, despite the fact that the military and the security services and large sections of the Russian population would be, to put it mildly, very unhappy about an agreement of this kind. Now, here I am going to state my own view. Perhaps this is where we are going to, where we are heading. Maybe Kellogg will present a plan on Trump's behalf along these lines and say to Putin, well, let's stop the battle on the current line of contact. Let's agree a ceasefire. Let's accept that the Russians can retain control of all the territories that they currently occupy. Let's then discuss possible buffer zones and things of that kind. Let's agree a peacekeeping force that goes into Ukraine to enforce this peace. Let's also go further still and agree that we can disagree about Ukraine's NATO entry and kick this all into the long grass. Maybe presented with this proposal from Kellogg, Putin and those immediately close to him will agree to all of this. Maybe that is what will happen. But I have to say, I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because I read every day what Putin himself says and what other Russian officials say. And I see no indication whatsoever that they are prepared to entertain a settlement on these lines. I accept that, there are undoubtedly voices in Moscow that do want to prioritize some kind of settlement with Russia, with the West, that they want to go back as far as possible to business as usual and all of those things. But my own sense is that Putin himself feels deeply betrayed by the many concessions and agreements he made to the West over many years. The fact that many people say that because he agreed to the Minsk agreement and to all sorts of other agreements with the West, that means that he's going to that means that he's inclined to agree to something similar again. I understand that, but the one thing I notice is that Putin has repeatedly himself engaged in self-criticism on this very point about the fact that he was personally deceived, that he allowed himself to be fooled by people like Merkel about the Minsk agreement, that they lied to him, the Western powers lied to him. It's Putin himself who says these things. And why assume, therefore, given his known feelings on this topic, that he would allow himself to be deceived in the same way again? Every single Russian official that has spoken about this matter, including, by the way, Putin himself, has made it absolutely clear that the starting point for any negotiations is going to be the terms that Putin himself set out to the foreign ministry back in June. That means not just the entire territory of the four regions, but it also means a definite cast iron agreement that Ukraine will not join NATO and will adopt neutral status. And as to the idea of a peacekeeping force, the Russians have to say it again very simply, repeatedly rejected it. They have repeatedly said that they do not agree to this, that they would strongly oppose the idea of a peacekeeping force from the Western powers. Naryshkin has said it, the Russians have said it many, many times. And, well, this is an article that appeared a few days ago in Responsible Statecraft by Anatol Levin. European peacekeepers in Ukraine, a horrible idea. Trump and other leaders reportedly discussed the plan, but it's a trial balloon that should be shot down immediately. And Levin, who has a lot more contacts with senior people in Russia than I do, just say, he says this, that quite apart from all of the other many problems that there are about deploying peacekeepers to Ukraine, which I will come to shortly, he also says this: there is just one problem. According to every Russian official and expert with whom my colleagues, he means his colleagues at the Quincy Institute, and I have spoken, most recently on Thursday. So this article appeared on the 16th of December. In other words, just 2 days ago. Thursday last week, they were talking to someone who is either a Russian official or a Russian expert. So this continues to be the current Russian position. Every Russian official and expert with whom my colleagues and I have spoken, most recently on Thursday, say the idea of Western troops in Ukraine is just as unacceptable to the Russian government and establishment as NATO membership for Ukraine itself. The Russians see no essential difference between the two. Seen from Moscow, a Western peacekeeping force would be simply a NATO advance party that would provide cover for the gradual introduction of more and more NATO forces. Indeed, whilst President Zelensky has said that Ukraine may consider the idea of peacekeepers, it would only do so if it is also given a clear timeline for future NATO membership. If this proposal is put forward by Kellogg, President-elect Trump's choice as his Ukraine envoy in negotiations, the Russian side will reject it out of hand, and if it is insisted on, the talks will fail. I agree. That is exactly my own understanding. It would be a complete turnabout on the part of the Russians, one which they show no sign of making, to agree to a peacekeeping force. Moreover, not only are the Russians hostile, implacably hostile, to a peacekeeping force, it turns out that some Europeans are also. No less a person than Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, who is about as hardline and anti-Russian political figure in Europe as it gets. Anyway, he is now saying that this whole idea is misconceived and should be dropped. He said that in order to establish a peacekeeping force, that would be sufficient to deter the Russians along the entire line of contact. No fewer than 150,000 troops from the West would have to be deployed to Ukraine. Now that brings us into the same territory as Naryshkin from the SVR said about a week ago or 2 weeks ago, when Naryshkin said that the plan was to deploy 100,000 peacekeepers so-called peacekeepers to Ukraine. And Stubb says that you would actually need 150,000. But Stubb makes the further point that these would just be the troops on the ground in order to regularly rotate them, in order to keep them supported and supplied in a position where the Russian army would be deterred by them. These 150,000 troops would have to be supported by 300,000 others. We would be talking about a force of 450,000 men in order to convincingly deter the Russians. And Stubb is saying that that is a fantasy, that you're never going to come up with numbers like that. The only way that you can secure Ukraine's long-term position is by offering Ukraine firm security guarantees. And though Stubb, of course, doesn't say it, I have no doubt at all that, like Zelensky, what Stubb means is membership of NATO. And that takes me back, by the way, to what Levin in the same article says. It seems likely that once European establishments and populations have had time to think about this idea, this is the idea of sending vast numbers of peacekeepers to Ukraine, they will in fact let it drop. For the soldiers in this force would be placed in a position of considerable danger, which it is unlikely that their fellow citizens would tolerate. When Macron first suggested French troops for Ukraine earlier this year, opinion polls showed overwhelming majorities of French citizens opposing this idea. The dangers should indeed be obvious. On the one hand, Ukrainians determined to regain Ukraine's lost territories by provoking a direct war between NATO and Russia would have every incentive to try to create armed clashes into which the Western peacekeepers would be drawn. I've discussed this myself in an earlier program. On the other hand, if Moscow really wanted to test NATO and take advantage of future internal splits in the West, how better to do it than to threaten NATO peacekeepers in Ukraine rather than on NATO territory, thus not covered by NATO's Article 5. There is either a deep cognitive dissonance or a deep dishonesty in Western hawks who warn about an alleged future Russian threat to NATO's resolve in the Baltic states, proposing to give Russia a far greater and more plausible opportunity to do so in Ukraine. In the circumstances, it seems obvious that in order for European governments and their military chiefs to agree such a proposal, even in principle, they would require ironclad and public guarantees from the Trump administration that the US military would intervene with full force to rescue their peacekeepers if they did come under Russian attack. And if you remember, one of my recent programs, I discussed an article by Mr. Norman in the Wall Street Journal, which says that in fact the Europeans have already been saying to the Trump people that they are not seriously considering sending their forces to Ukraine unless they get that kind of ironclad guarantee from the United States to come to their rescue if they find themselves in trouble. And Levin continues, this would mean very much the kind of commitment to Ukraine and to potential war in Russia that Trump and leading members of his team are determined to avoid. And that, I would have thought, should kill this whole plan stone dead, and with it, that which many people believe is the Kellogg proposal. Except, to repeat again, I'm not convinced that Kellogg has ever formulated or thought through this proposal in the way that many people imagine. It all stems from certain points and memes and thoughts expressed in the Kellogg Fights report, which appeared all the way back in April, while the US election was underway, and which was clearly intended to help provide Trump with talking points he could use in any debate against the then assumed to be Democrat Party challenger Joe Biden in the election. So I think that we should be very careful before treating these proposals, these ideas in the Kellogg Fights plan, as any kind of properly thought through or properly considered proposal. I think that what we're going to find is that deployment of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine is not going to happen, that there will be difficulties, very great difficulties, sorting out any kind of ceasefire idea in Ukraine, at least for the time being. Zelensky, by the way, is again making statements, even as I make this program, which appear to push back against that idea. He's again talking about the need to put Ukraine in a stronger position before negotiations take place. And I don't think the Russians are going to look with any favour on any plan that says that even notionally NATO membership might one day be considered for Ukraine, and certainly not a plan which involves deployment of NATO peacekeepers or peacekeepers from NATO countries in Ukraine, or indeed a peacekeeping force in Ukraine in any conceivable form. Now, I went to some length in my previous program to say why, despite the great difficulties in putting together a peace proposal, it is nonetheless an absolutely necessary thing that diplomacy between Russia and the United States resumes. General Kellogg has now confirmed that he does intend to visit Kiev at some point over the next couple of weeks. Be interesting to see what sort of reception he receives, by the way, when he goes there. And it will also be very interesting to see what he says when he is there and after he's spoken with Zelensky. But importantly, he's now floating the possibility of going to Moscow as well, though perhaps unsurprisingly, it looks likely that that will happen only after Trump's inauguration on the 20th of January. And apparently there's been some flurry and alarm about this in some places. There's concern that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other again. But as I discussed in my previous program, that is a very good thing. I think that the idea that we're going to get a quick end to the war in Ukraine is unrealistic, given where we are. To repeat again, on the actual terms for ending the war, given that the Russians are winning the war, there is no logical reason why they should agree to terms, some of the terms that people are suggesting. And I don't myself think that Putin is under any domestic pressure, any significant domestic pressure to do so. Just say that again. So, putting it all together, I think that discussions between the Americans and the Russians are inherently a good thing, even if the relationship remains deeply adversarial. And it is very important that the conflict in Ukraine doesn't acquire such overwhelming significance that the whole objective of re-establishing a dialogue between Washington and Moscow is not made hostage to a successful outcome of a negotiation to end the war in Ukraine. That would be a disaster. It would potentially put us all the way back to the terrible position in which we find ourselves now. It's been widely overlooked, but Donald Trump is continuing to put together his foreign policy and security team. And though he has indeed appointed Kellogg as his special envoy on ending the conflict in Ukraine, it's now just been announced that Rick Grinnell, who is known to have a different perspective on the war to Kellogg, or at least has taken perhaps an even more realistic view about ending the war in Ukraine, and who seems more open to the idea, still more open to the idea, of re-establishing contacts with the Russians. Anyway, he has now been given, or will be nominated by Trump, for an ambassadorship at large, an ambassadorship for special tasks. And I wonder whether he's going to be working alongside Kellogg to try to get the negotiation, a contacts with Moscow, a dialogue with Moscow, finally and again underway. And Trump, incidentally, has again signalled his strong opposition to missile strikes on pre-2014 Russia, and has, I think, made it fairly clear that he intends to reverse Biden's decision to authorize such strikes as soon as he becomes president. So lots of things are happening, lots of pieces are moving on the board. My own view is that we won't get a clear idea of how this negotiation is going to work out until contacts between the Russians and the Americans formally begin, until the Americans start to listen to what the Russians are saying, and hopefully they will take that on board and they will recalibrate and reform their ideas accordingly. Meanwhile, the Europeans, even as they quarrel and argue with each other about peacekeeping forces, it looks like are once again floating back to the idea of confiscating the Russian assets. There's huge disagreements and arguments about this, but the temptation to seize those assets continues to be, for some European leaders, incredibly strong. And it's not difficult to see why, because with American aid for Ukraine likely to start tailing off, with the Europeans going through a fiscal crisis which is deepening and which is going to make it more and more difficult for them to continue to fund Ukraine, here you have a pot of money, $300 billion, which they could seize and which could tide over Ukraine for perhaps 2 years if it was made available to Ukraine. There still is a lot of opposition, apparently. Germany is opposed. I'm not sure what Friedrich Merz is going to make of that opposition, but then of course that will partly depend not just on his views, but on the collective views of whatever government he sets up after the elections in February. Scholz has, of course, lost his vote of confidence in the German Bundestag, Everybody knew that he would. And there will, it seems now, almost certainly be elections in Germany. But anyway, Germany for the moment is opposed, so is Belgium, so are various other countries. We'll see where this particular story goes. Always radicalism, the whole trend in European policy over the course of this war is towards taking ever more extreme and radical anti-Russian positions, even as making all of these steps contributes to the ongoing implosion of the European economy. So, given that we're talking about people who show no hesitation about shooting themselves in the foot, who is to say that they're not about going to do it with the Russian assets all over again? Well, in the meantime, since I'm talking about the Europeans, the President of the European Commission, no less, has now gone to Turkey. She's had a meeting with Erdogan in Ankara. She made some extraordinary comments about how the European Union will not lift sanctions on Syria unless all its objectives, all its requirements are satisfied. That apparently includes closure of the Russian bases. I have to say again, the extremism of this is incredible. Apparently, despite the Syrians having overthrown President Assad, which was the original point, one assumed, of the sanctions, in spite of the Syrians now being in the process of setting up some sort of alternative government to Assad's, in spite of the humanitarian catastrophe that is playing out or could play out in Syria, the European Union apparently continues to insist that it will maintain sanctions so long as the Russian bases stay, something which has annoyed Erdogan. His spokesman has already criticized this position. And, well, one does wonder what HTS makes of it. But anyway, the meeting between Ursula von der Leyen and Erdogan, which took in Ankara, was nonetheless remarkable. And it again highlights the way in which, when he detects weakness, Erdogan immediately steps in to raise his demands. We've had fairly detailed accounts of what took place over the course of this meeting. And from what I can understand, Erdogan basically delivered a long, peremptory lecture in, frankly, contemptuous language to Ursula von der Leyen, making it very clear that it is Turkey that is now in the driving seat in Syria, and that Turkey will do what it wants, and that the Europeans will just have to lump it. So Ursula said that apparently in response to Erdogan, that whilst the EU recognises Turkey's legitimate concerns about the threat of terrorism from Syria, the Turkish media pointedly said that she didn't really elaborate about US support for the PKK and the YPG, the Kurdish militia groups in Syria. And apparently this provoked a long tirade, so I understand. Well, tirade is too strong a word, but a long lecture from Erdogan. And then he went on to say that Syria should be, these are apparently direct quotes from him, Syria should be swiftly recovered through the strong support of its neighbours, friendly countries, the international community, including the European Union and international bodies. The international community failed to convey sufficient support to the people of Syria whilst they were being slaughtered in the past 13 years. Now they can compensate for it through support to reconstruction recovery of Syria. We expect the EU to diversify its support that it used to relieve our burden in the past to facilitate voluntary returns of Syrians. It is essential that this support should include basic infrastructure investments in Syria, so that it can be long-term, comprehensive and sustainable. We are ready to work together as a country which has been active in Syria's north in many projects. And then, of course, he made it clear that it's not just demands that he's making about refugees and about reconstruction in Syria that Erdogan wants to talk to von der Leyen about. He also said that he wants to talk about Turkey's unending bid for EU membership. President Erdogan spoke about Turkey's EU membership talks and said it had strategic importance for his country. And EU leaders will gather in Brussels on Thursday, and Erdogan listed Turkey's expectations from the major gathering. We expect decisions to be made for restrictions towards Turkey to be lifted. We expect the suspended high-level dialogue to be revived, customs union to be updated, and visa process to be facilitated until full visa liberalization. Turkey and the EU need a stronger relationship, and as a candidate country, we have the will to achieve it. I believe under Ms. von der Leyen, the EU will exhibit the same will. And on it goes. I don't know how Ursula von der Leyen feels about being subjected to this long, peremptory list of demands from Erdogan. I have to say that reading this text, I get the strong impression that Erdogan himself doesn't take her especially seriously. But anyway, it must have felt like being confronted by a bulldozer churning relentlessly forward, one demand after another, quite what Ursula, as I said, made under the weight of this avalanche. I have absolutely no idea. Meanwhile, Erdogan, it is now confirmed, did make a speech to a regional branch of his party in Turkey, in which he again spoke about how Aleppo, Damascus, Raqqa, other places in Syria had once been part of the Ottoman Empire, and how, had events turned out differently at the end of the First World War, they might be Turkish cities still. It seems that he didn't actually speak about the annexation of these cities into Turkey. And the Russian Foreign Ministry has rather stiffly published a rejoinder saying that they assume that Erdogan was only talking hypothetically, because, as they pointedly reminded him, Turkey's public position is that it continues to support Syria's territorial integrity, as of course does Russia. I would say that that is a rather more effective way of handling Erdogan than the one Ursula von der Leyen exhibited in Ankara. From what I can tell from the various commentaries and readouts that have been appearing in the Turkish media, even as she faced this, as I said, endless cascade of demands and criticisms from Erdogan, she basically nodded agreement to everyone. Anyway, that is where I finish today's program. The situation in Syria, as far as I can see, by the way, remains as bad as always, and there's more reports that the Turkish army is now going to enter Syria in full force. But as I said, this is where this program, today's program, ends. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.